When my parents announced their divorce, it didn't come as a shock to me. The tension between them had been simmering for years. They weren't the type to have loud, dramatic fights, but the silence that stretched between them during family dinners was just as telling. It was as though they existed in two separate worlds under the same roof, each waiting for the other to make a move that could either mend or break the fragile dynamic they shared. When the news came, my father, Robert, was the first to sit me down and explain his side of things. "It just wasn't working anymore," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "I tried, but your mother ... she's so distant, you know. Always has been. I don't blame her entirely, but it's exhausting trying to hold things together when the other person doesn't want to meet you halfway." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. My mother, Lisa, hadn't shared much about her feelings on the matter. When I asked her why the marriage was ending, she simply said, "It's for the best. Some things can't be fixed." Her brevity left me confused and leaning toward my father's version of events. He seemed hurt, vulnerable, and in need of support. My mother, by contrast, appeared detached, as though she had already moved on emotionally. In the weeks following their separation, my father leaned on me heavily. He moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the family home where we had spent so many years together. It was sparsely furnished when I first visited, with only a couch, a coffee table, and a small dining set in the living room. Boxes were stacked in every corner, and the walls were bare. "It's not much, but it's home for now," he said, trying to sound optimistic. I could see the pain in his eyes, though, and it tugged at my heart. I offered to help him unpack and make the place feel more lived in. Over the next few weekends, we hung pictures, assembled furniture, and shopped for little touches to make the apartment cozier, throw pillows, curtains, a rug for the living room. As we worked, he opened up more about his feelings. "I just don't understand how it got to this point," he said one evening as we put up shelves in the kitchen. "I gave her everything, my time, my love, and it was never enough. She always seemed so cold, so unapproachable. I don't know what I did wrong." His words painted a picture of a man who had tried his best and been met with indifference. I couldn't help but feel sympathy for him. At the same time, I began to feel a quiet resentment toward my mother. Why hadn't she tried harder? Why had she let things deteriorate to this point? My father started calling me more frequently, often just to talk. He would recount memories from their marriage, both good and bad, trying to make sense of where things had gone wrong. "Remember that trip to the lake when you were 10? He asked me once. "Your mom and I fought the whole way there, but the second we saw you laughing and splashing in the water, it was like everything else didn't matter. I thought we'd always find a way back to that." These conversations became a routine, and I found myself growing closer to him in a way I hadn't before. Growing up, he had always been more of a provider than a deeply emotional presence in my life. He worked long hours and often left the parenting to my mother. But now, in his vulnerable state, he was opening up in ways I never expected. It felt good to be there for him, to feel needed and appreciated. Meanwhile, my relationship with my mother grew strained. She rarely reached out, and when we did talk, our conversations were brief and superficial. She didn't seem interested in discussing the divorce or her feelings about it, which only deepened my perception that she was the cold, unfeeling person my father described. I wanted to confront her, to ask why she hadn't fought harder for their marriage, but something held me back. Perhaps I was afraid of what she might say. One evening, I stopped by my father's apartment with takeout for dinner. He looked more relaxed than he had in weeks, and I commented on it. "I'm getting there," he said with a small smile. "It helps, having you around. I don't know what I'd do without you, kiddo." We sat down to eat, and he started talking about his plans for the future. "I've been thinking about taking up photography again," he said. "It's something I used to love before ... before life got in the way. Maybe this is my chance to rediscover who I am." His optimism was infectious, and I encouraged him to go for it. It felt good to see him finding a sense of purpose again. But as much as I wanted to believe his version of events that he was the wronged party, trying to rebuild his life after an unfair betrayal, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling that I didn't have the full story. There were moments, small and fleeting, that gave me pause. Sometimes, when he spoke about my mother, there was a bitterness in his tone that felt disproportionate. He would make offhand comments about how she had always been selfish or how she never appreciated the life he provided for her. At first, I brushed these remarks off as the natural result of heartbreak and anger. But as they became more frequent, I started to wonder if there was more to their story than he was letting on. Still, I pushed those doubts aside. He was my father, and he needed me. That was what mattered. As the months went on, I became a fixture in his life. We spent weekends together, sometimes going to the movies or taking walks in the park. He seemed to be healing, slowly but surely, and I was proud of the role I played in his recovery. It wasn't until much later that I realized how one-sided my support had been and how blind I had been to the cracks in his narrative. But at the time, I saw myself as the dutiful child, doing what any loving son or daughter would do. It never occurred to me to question his version of events, or to dig deeper into the reasons behind the divorce. After all, he was my father. Why wouldn't I believe him? Months passed, and my father seemed to be settling into his new life. His apartment was finally starting to feel like a home, and he even picked up a new hobby: photography. He would text me photos of sunsets or cityscapes he captured during his walks, each one accompanied by a caption about how he was learning to appreciate life again. I was happy for him, and the time I spent with him continued to strengthen our bond. But as close as we were becoming, a nagging sense of unease began to grow in the back of my mind. There was something about the way he spoke about my mother that didn't sit right with me. His criticisms of her weren't just casual remarks, they were pointed and frequent. It was almost as though he was trying to convince me of something, to solidify his version of events in my mind. Every time he mentioned her, it was to highlight another perceived flaw: how she was always so controlling, or how she never showed any gratitude for the sacrifices he made. The bitterness in his tone felt disproportionate, and it left me with questions I didn't know how to ask. The unease turned into curiosity one weekend when I stopped by his apartment to help him organize some old boxes he had brought over from storage. They were filled with the remnants of his life before the divorce: family photos, letters, and documents he hadn't touched in years. We spent the afternoon sorting through them, reminiscing about old times. There were pictures of family vacations, birthday parties, and holidays, snapshots of a life that, in hindsight, seemed much happier than the reality I remembered. "Your mom loved these vacations," he said, holding up a photo of us at the beach. Or at least I thought she did. Looking back, maybe she was just putting on a show. His words stung, and I couldn't help but feel defensive on her behalf. "I don't think that's fair," I said. "She always seemed happy on those trips." He shrugged, as if to say it didn't matter anymore, and changed the subject. But his dismissive attitude stuck with me, and I found myself replaying the conversation in my mind long after I left his apartment. The turning point came later that evening when I returned to pick up my jacket, which I had accidentally left behind. My father wasn't home, but he had given me a spare key, so I let myself in. As I grabbed my jacket from the back of a chair, I noticed one of the boxes we had been sorting through was still open on the floor. Curious, I knelt down to take a closer look. Among the loose papers and photographs was a stack of old letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes wasn't my mother's, and the dates ranged from several years ago to just before the divorce. My heart began to race as I untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The words on the page were intimate, filled with affection and longing. It didn't take long for me to realize they were love letters from another woman. Her name was Rachel, and she wrote about stolen moments and promises for a future they could share. As I read through the letters, the timeline became clear: their relationship had lasted for years, overlapping with my parents' marriage. Shock and disbelief washed over me. My father, the man who had painted himself as the victim of a cold and distant wife, had been having an affair all along. The betrayal I felt was immediate and overwhelming. I had spent months comforting him, defending him, and even resenting my mother based on his version of events. And now, holding these letters in my hands, I realized how little I truly knew about what had happened between them. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, staring at the letters, but eventually I heard the sound of keys jingling at the door. My father walked in, surprised to see me still there. "Forgot my jacket," I said, my voice trembling. He noticed the open box and the letters in my hand. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone defensive. "I should be asking you that," I shot back, holding up one of the letters. "Who's Rachel?" His face paled, and for a moment he looked like he might deny everything. But then he sighed and sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not what you think," he said weakly. "Not what I think?" I snapped. "You've been lying to me this whole time. You made me believe Mom was the problem, that she was the reason your marriage fell apart. But it was you. You were cheating on her." "It wasn't like that," he said, his voice rising. "You don't understand what it was like, living with your mother. She pushed me away for years. Rachel. Rachel was there for me when I needed someone. She made me feel alive again." "Alive?" I repeated, incredulous. "And what about Mom? Did you even think about how this would affect her? How it would affect me?" He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "But your mother wasn't innocent in all of this. She knew about Rachel. She chose to stay quiet and let things fall apart." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mother had known? She had kept this secret, endured the betrayal, and allowed me to believe my father's lies without ever defending herself. The weight of it all was too much to process. "I need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Wait," he called after me, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my jacket and left, my mind racing with questions and emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. That night I sat in my car outside my apartment, staring at the dashboard. The image of those letters was burned into my mind, along with the realization that the man I had been so eager to support was not the person I thought he was. My father's betrayal wasn't just about his affair, it was about the way he had manipulated me, twisting the truth to make himself look like the victim. For the first time, I began to wonder what else he had lied about and what my mother had been hiding all along. After uncovering the letters and confronting my father, the weight of the discovery stayed with me like a storm cloud that refused to pass. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the scene in his apartment, the letters, and his weak attempts to justify what he had done. But more than anything, my thoughts kept circling back to my mother. She had known about the affair, endured the betrayal, and yet never told me her side of the story. Why had she stayed silent? Why had she allowed me to turn against her without defending herself? The next morning, I decided I couldn't carry this alone. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. I called my mother and asked if we could meet. "Of course," she said, her voice calm but curious. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal over the phone. "I just need to talk to you about everything." We agreed to meet at her house later that afternoon. As I drove there, my emotions swung wildly between anger, confusion, and guilt. For months, I had believed my father's narrative without question, and now I was beginning to realize how unfair I had been to her. When I arrived, my mother greeted me with her usual reserved warmth. She looked tired, though, and I wondered how much of that was the toll of the divorce and how much was my own distance from her. "Come in," she said, motioning toward the living room. She had already set out tea and cookies on the coffee table, a habit from when I was a child, and we'd sit together after school to talk about my day. It felt strange, stepping back into this familiar routine, knowing the heavy conversation that was about to follow. We sat down, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I didn't know how to start. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "I found something yesterday. At Dad's place." Her expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "What did you find?" "Letters," I said, "from someone named Rachel." They. They were having an affair, weren't they?" She looked down at her tea, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. "Yes," she said quietly. The confirmation, though expected, still hit me like a punch to the gut. "You knew?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Yes," she said again, her voice steady now. "I knew." "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. "Why did you let me believe it was all your fault? That you were the reason the marriage ended?" She sighed, setting her cup down. "Because it wasn't about you. It was about your father and me. I didn't see any point in dragging you into it. You had enough to deal with, and I didn't want to hurt you more than necessary. But you let him lie to me, I said. You let him make me think you were cold, that you didn't care about him or the marriage. How could you just let that happen? Her eyes met mine, calm but firm. Because I didn't think it would help you to know the truth. What good would it have done to turn you against your father? I thought it was better for you to have your own relationship with him, without my bitterness getting in the way. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So you just took the blame? Let him ruin your reputation with me so he could play the victim? She leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. It wasn't about reputation, and it wasn't about him. It was about you. I didn't care what he told you about me, as long as you had a parent you felt you could trust. The enormity of her sacrifice began to sink in, and with it, a flood of guilt. I had spent months resenting her, criticizing her in my mind, and yet she had chosen to endure that for my sake. It didn't make the situation any less painful, but it did force me to see her in a new light. Why didn't you leave him sooner? I asked, my voice softer now. She hesitated, then said, I stayed for you. I thought if we could hold things together until you were older, it would be easier for you. But by the time I realized that wasn't possible, it was already too late. The damage was done. I thought about all the times I had seen her smile through tense dinners, the quiet moments when she seemed lost in thought, the way she had withdrawn over the years. I had chalked it up to her personality, assuming she was simply a reserved person. But now I understood that those silences were her way of coping with a reality she couldn't change. Do you regret staying? I asked. She took a long sip of her tea before answering. Sometimes, she admitted. But I don't regret protecting you. If that means you were angry with me for a while, I can live with that. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much time feeling betrayed by her silence, but now I realized it had been an act of love. A flawed one, perhaps, but love nonetheless. I'm sorry, I said, my voice breaking. I'm sorry I believed him. I'm sorry I didn't ask you sooner. Her expression softened, and she reached out to take my hand. You don't need to apologize, she said. You were doing what you thought was right. And now you know the truth. That's what matters. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between us. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. My mother wasn't perfect, but neither was my father. They were both flawed, both human, and both trying to navigate a situation that had no easy answers. As I left her house that evening, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I couldn't change the past, but I could start to rebuild my relationship with my mother. And as for my father, I knew I needed to confront him again, not just for his lies, but for the way he had manipulated me into taking his side. The truth wasn't easy to face, but it was the first step toward understanding, forgiveness, and, eventually, healing. The days following my conversation with my mother were some of the most introspective of my life. I found myself thinking about the past with new clarity, replaying memories in my mind and piecing together a picture of my parents' marriage that was far more complex than I had ever imagined. My father wasn't the villain I wanted to paint him as, nor was my mother the saint I suddenly wanted her to be. They were both people flawed, wounded, and navigating a relationship that had unraveled long before it officially ended. Despite this newfound perspective, I couldn't ignore the anger simmering inside me. My father had lied to me, manipulated me, and used my trust to shield himself from accountability. It was as though he had built a version of reality that centered on his pain, conveniently leaving out the parts that might complicate the narrative. I needed to confront him not just for myself, but to clear the air once and for all. I called him and asked if we could meet for dinner. He sounded hesitant, perhaps sensing the shift in my tone, but he agreed. We chose a small restaurant near his apartment, one we had visited a few times before. The setting was cozy and familiar, but the tension between us was palpable from the moment we sat down. He started with small talk, asking about work and whether I'd been keeping up with my hobbies. I answered politely but kept my responses short, waiting for the right moment to bring up what was on my mind. Finally, as the waiter brought our drinks, I decided there was no point in delaying. Dad, I said, setting down my glass, we need to talk about Rachel. His hand froze midway to his fork, and his face tightened. "I see," he said slowly. "So you talked to your mother?" "I did," I said, "and she told me everything. She knew about the affair, and she let me believe it was her fault. She let me believe you." He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "I was afraid this would happen," he admitted. "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Like what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "The truth? That you cheated on Mom for years and then blamed her for the divorce?" His expression darkened, but he didn't deny it. "You don't understand," he said. "Your mother and I were already broken long before Rachel came into the picture. We were just two people going through the motions, pretending for your sake. Rachel ... She was a mistake, yes, but she wasn't the cause of the divorce. Your mother and I were over long before that." "That doesn't excuse what you did," I said. "You lied to me, Dad. You let me think Mom was the problem, that she was cold and unloving, when the truth is, you were the one who gave up on the marriage." His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he might argue. But then his shoulders slumped, and he looked down at the table. "You're right," he said quietly. "I lied. I made mistakes. I was selfish. And I hurt your mother in ways I can't take back. I told myself I was protecting you, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. I didn't want you to see me as the bad guy." His admission took some of the wind out of my anger, but it didn't erase the hurt. "Do you even realize what you've done?" I asked. "You made me doubt her. You made me resent her. And all this time she was just trying to protect me from you." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. I don't want this to define our relationship." For a long moment I didn't say anything. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to let go of the anger and move forward. But another part of me wasn't ready. Trust, once broken, isn't easily rebuilt. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," I said finally, "but I'm willing to try. I just need time." He nodded, his expression somber. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here when you're ready." The rest of the dinner passed in awkward silence, and when we parted ways, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The confrontation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. For the first time, I felt like I could begin to move forward not just with my father, but with my understanding of my parents' marriage and its impact on me. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with my mother. I visited her more often, listened to her stories, and asked questions about her life, things I had never thought to ask before. She opened up slowly, sharing pieces of herself I had never known. I began to see her not just as my mother, but as a person with her own dreams, struggles, and vulnerabilities. At the same time, I kept some distance from my father. I needed space to process everything and decide how I wanted our relationship to look moving forward. He reached out occasionally, sending texts or leaving voicemails, but he respected my request for time. One day, a few months later, I received a package in the mail. It was from my father, and inside was a photo album. The cover was simple, embossed with the word family. As I flipped through the pages, I saw pictures from my childhood, moments I had almost forgotten: birthday parties, school plays, family vacations. But what stood out most were the captions he had written beneath each photo. "Lisa helping you with your science project. She was so proud of you. Our last trip to the lake. One of the happiest days I can remember. You and your mom baking cookies. She always loved doing that with you." The album wasn't just a collection of memories, it was an acknowledgement. My father was trying to show me that he understood what he had lost and that he wanted to honor the good in their marriage, despite its ending. I called him later that evening. "Thank you for the album," I said. "I just wanted you to know that I see it now," he said. "All the things I took for granted, all the ways I failed. I can't change the past, but I want to do better moving forward." "I appreciate that," I said. And for the first time, I meant it. The journey to forgiveness wasn't easy, and it wasn't linear. There were days when the anger resurfaced, when I questioned whether I could truly trust him again. But there were also moments of connection, when I saw glimpses of the man he wanted to be. Slowly, cautiously, I began to let him back into my life. As for my mother, our relationship grew stronger than ever. She taught me what resilience looked like, and her quiet strength became a source of inspiration. I realized that love isn't always loud or obvious. It's in the sacrifices, the patience, and the willingness to endure for the sake of someone else. In the end, my parents' marriage was a lesson in the complexities of love, forgiveness, and humanity. They weren't perfect, but neither am I. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all: to embrace the imperfections, to learn from the mistakes, and to keep moving forward.